Boker Tov. So today's daf is daf Nun Daled, and we pick up let's pick up with 1, 2, 3, 6 lines, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the top, Obekaver. And what we are doing, oh look, it didn't get erased. What we're doing is we're looking at the two psukim that talk about Tumas Meis, and what we learned from the different words in the psukim, and in particular, because we want to understand what things are Metame Ba'ohel and what things are cause Tuma, there's not enough of it to cause Tuma, as it were, this quantity in an Ohel, but it is through direct touch. And both of the psukim and the pshat are talking about touch. And the open field means specifically not under a roof, so it's not Tumas Ohel. And then the Al Hanogea, both of them seem to be talking about touch. But what these Midrashei Halacha do that we looked at say that Al Pnei Hasadeh somehow means you're over the face of the mate, you're like leaning over it, and you're not exactly touching it, and it's talking about Ohel. Besides that this pasuk is talking about Ohel. And therefore we learn all these things, Chalal, Cherv, Mate, Etzem, Adam, and Kaver, are things that cause Tuma in the Ohel. So Halal somehow is understood to mean a thing that is sort of, has been an Aver min achai, a limb that's been severed from a person. There's not an entire corpse, but this is something that itself is dead. Cherev is a very important halacha, which we're going to get to today, which is Cherev harehu kechalal. The sword is like the corpse itself. So say to me the corpse is an avi avot hatumah, so the person who touches it is an av, not a rishon, and is tamei for 7 days. So a sword also has the same halacha, and a person who touches a sword, I'm putting certain quote marks, whatever halacha we're going to define means cherev, is the sword is considered the avi avot, and the person who touches it is an av and is tamei for 7 days. Now what constitutes a cherev? That is going to be a major debate of the Rishonim in today's daf. It is basically doesn't have to be a sword, it's abstracted, but it starts with the possibility of all metal vessels, and might even include all vessels. Okay, so we're going to see what that is. And if a cherev comes tumas meis, it actually is an avi avot hatum'ah. Maybe it's worth mentioning about this a parallel to another area of halacha where something does not go down a level because of its more identity rather than its contact, and that's the idea of the mishkav and moshav of a zav. A zav is an av hatum'ah. Okay, maybe it's an avi avot, one level high or whatever, but a zav is an av hatum'ah. If a zav or a zava or nida sits on something, it's called a mishkav or a moshav, and that is not a rishon. A normal vessel that touches a zav, or a person that touches a zav, is a rishon. But the thing that a zav sits on, and he doesn't even have to come in contact with it. It could be a series of cushions, like the princess and the pea. It could be like the 10th cushion below him, and that's called his seat, and that's also an av hatum'ah by its identity as the seat of a zav. So that's another sort of source of an av hatum'ah, and it's not this normal sense that it goes down a level through the process of contact. In some similar conceptual way, a cherev, now if it really was the sword that killed somebody, maybe you could understand that is meaningful, it has status, like something that was sat on, but we're going to wind up abstracting it. Okay, so at this level, let's say metal vessels that were tumat made, either under the same roof or touched a dead body, are conceptualized as cherev and are an avi avot hatumah just like the mate. So it's called cherev harehu kechalal. More about that a little bit later today. Mate, again, somehow all of this is understood to be talking about something out of the ordinary, not a normal corpse. So if halal is something that has been a dead limb but not a dead person, mate is also a limb but an aver min hamate, and that's metame ba'ohel. Etzem Adam is a bone, but here, and particularly in the area of bones, is where we find a difference between the amount that causes tumah in an ohel and the amount that causes tumah through touch. And the difference here is Etzem Adam as opposed to Etzem. So the way I understand it, this wasn't spelled out in the Midrash Halacha, but this is what I understand what's being done is, it has to be enough bones that represent the entire person. So that would be, rov minyan, rov binyan, shidra, gugoles, or a certain quantity that comes from those amount of bones. That's etzem adam. And kaver is the grave itself, and that we said is the reason why graveyards are a problem. Because why don't you just say, not the grave, the coffin? Why don't you just say that the coffin is a tumas ohel and just stops the tumah? And the answer is because this principle of kever satum says if the coffin is sealed on all sides, the walls and the top, then the entire coffin is treated as the mate itself, and the tumah goes up and therefore it's matami not just keneged the mate, but keneged the entire, directly opposite the entire coffin, and the coffin doesn't serve as an ohel. So that's very important. This is the reason why we really have problems with graveyards, and we don't say that the coffin serves as an ohel. So those are the things that cause tuma be'ohel. Okay, so that's very important. That's the basis of the pasuk. Now we're going to look at this next pasuk, which seems to be pretty much the same terms, and we're going to say that that's telling you things that are tuma through touch and not through ohel. So what are going to be those different things? Okay, so etzem is the most obvious difference. Here it's etzem adam, and here it's etzem. So even a small amount of bone, the size of a barley grain, is through touch. That's the major place where there's a difference between tumas ohel and tumas maga is bones. Now, how about chalo and mate? You remember here, chalo and mate were aver min achayim, aver min amet. So this braita is the braita that supports Reish Lakish, who says you can have an aver min hachai and aver min amet that are matame b'maga and not b'ohel. So this aver min hachai and aver min have enough flesh on it that if it were attached to a person, the limb could survive. And this is aver min hachai and aver min amet that do not have enough flesh on it. And Reish Lakish says, here's my proof. This braita shows that there is such a thing as aver min hachai and aver min without enough flesh on it that still cause tumah through touch. And again, if there was enough bone, if there was etzem kisaora, that would be the tumah of bone. So it must be that there's not enough bone, there's not enough flesh, but because it still is a limb, it still causes contact through touch. And that was the debate of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish supports himself based on that braita. So I'll take the questions. Let's just read that braita together, and then if there's any questions, I'll take it. Okay? So let's start again from 2 lines from the top on Nundal Rabad Aleph. The ilu gabi nigia, when it comes to touch, Amar Rav Yehuda, Tanya, Rav Yehuda says we turn the braita, the al hanogea should be the al hanogea, be'etzem o b'chalal, be'etzem ze'etzem kise'ora. O b'chalal, ze'ever hanechla min achai, so something that has been sort of severed, from a live person. The ein bo halot arucha, there's not enough flesh that it could heal were it attached. O b'meit, ze'ever hanechla min ameit. Okay, O b'chever, and kever, which is the last one we haven't dealt with. Ze kever, Amar Reish Lakish, ze kever shalifnei hadibur. This is the kever before the divine speech. Now I'm going to bracket that for a second. That's very fascinating. But I'm going to bracket that just to get to the end of the argument, and then we'll go back to the kever. So hi aver mina mate, heiki dami. So this braita that includes an aver mina mate that causes tumah through touch. What's the case? If there's enough bone in it. That's bone. There must be. It's not enough bone. It's a limb. Not enough bone to cause tumah. Not enough flesh to heal. And nevertheless, again, I don't know what limb we're talking about, but nevertheless, because it's a limb, it causes tumah through touch. The Torah is including it. So you see that even though, and remember, the point was that when it said things that the Nazir is nigaleach, it only mentioned a limb with enough flesh. It never mentioned in ohel or touch a limb with not enough flesh. But Reish Lakish says, even though that's what the Mishnah sounds like, the Midrashei Halacha make it clear that a limb without enough flesh causes too much mate, and I'm going to assume, therefore, that a Nazir is going to be Migaleach if he touches it. Not for ohel, but if he touches it. Let's read Rabbi Yochanan's response, and then I'll take questions. Amalecha Rabbi Yochanan would say back, Ra'olam deleit the itba. There is enough bone in it for nogea be'etzem. It's etzem kisaora. That tosef, that braita. The inu inyin lemagao taneu inyin lemastao. So why does it have to be mentioned? If this has enough bone, so we already said etzem, enough bone. So it's to tell you that not only, because we dealt here with 2 types of tumah, touching, and we've decided that this was ohel. There's a third type of way you become tamei b'meit. Not you don't touch it. You're not in the same ohel, or you're not on top or below it, but you're carrying it. Okay, that's a lot in the Torah. It talks about somebody who carries tum'ah. So where does that fall? So is carrying carrying, and we know, as we've said before, it was in the Mishnah, carrying is like touching, right? So if it's enough to cause tuma through touch, it's enough through carrying. But where do we get that from?
When you say you're not touching it, you mean like you're carrying?
Yeah, it's in your knapsack.
Meaning you're not actually touching the...
Exactly, it's in your knapsack. It's in a knapsack, okay? You take a stick and sometimes moving is considered like carrying also. So says Rabbi Yochanan, you know what, in the end this really is just a variation of etzem kisa'ora. That's really the only area where touching is different than ohel is by bones. Okay, I don't agree with Reish Lakish that there's a second din of Azer. This is really just another variation of etzem. Why does it say it again? To tell you that it's not only through touch, it's even through carrying. Okay, so that's the debate of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. That's where we get it from the psukim, and that's the question of Aver min achai that does not have enough flesh is still enough of a object of tum'ah to cause tum'ah through touch. Now question. Yes.
One is, where is this? Is this teaching a Mishnah? It says in the Torah, it says an Oalos, but then it says it's Chulin, it's introduced by Tanya.
No, it's a Mishnah Oalos. You see that, what? The Amar Mar, that was what we didn't start with that. That was from the end of yesterday. Tuma Bokat, Vola Bokat, Yoredes. So that's Oalo Perk Zayin Mishnah Aleph, and it's cross-referenced in Chulin. The Gemara in Chulin quotes it.
When you call that Midrash, that's also Midrash Halach.
No. That Tosefta, the Tanya, the Tosefta not Tosefta, excuse me, the Midrash Halacha that interpreted this pasuk was introduced to Tanya in the previous Braita. The Gemara then at the end of that, when it mentioned Kever, quoted a Mishnah of Bokat Va'ola. Right. Okay, but the basic Braita that darshan this was Midrash Halacha. Okay, and the same that the basic Braita that darshans this is the Midrash Halacha. Although not in this, go ahead.
And from the Midrash on the Cherev that conceptualizes Kalim as Aviyavot Tumah, would you say that Chazal are conceptualizing human manufactured vessels the same way that they're conceptualizing the body that a Kadosh Baruch Hu has?
Well, but the problem is that I wouldn't go. I don't see that. First of all, a person that touches the mate is not an Aviyavot; is only an Av. So the vessels is a different status here. But I do think it is true that vessels and people, have sort of like similar areas of tumah. When you get to a sheni, the only thing that can become a sheni is like food, not people in vessels. So they tend to be within the same category. But I wouldn't read that into this, because here this is actually worse, in terms of its level of tumah than a person who touches the dead body. Yes.
So two things. Where would Reish Lakish learn tumah and mafah from?
Yeah, I don't know.
And the other question,
yes.
I conceptually see a difference between the etzem is like it sounds like you're actually touching the etzem, but
right.
The flesh, to say that it's also too much etzem, you actually thought that.
I understand. What can I tell you? It's a classic thing, the Gemara does. Eino inyan this, teneyu inyan that. I mean, I can't get too excited about that. Yes.
We're talking about too much ohel. When you say shidra and gulgolet, do you need both of them, or did one or the other?
So that was all of yesterday's daf. So get the notes from somebody who was in the class yesterday. Okay. In the end of the day, the Gemara doesn't explicitly conclude, but all the evidence points to one or the other, and that's the way the Rambam rules. Okay. Now let's get back to this fascinating phrase of kever lifnei hadibur, before the divine speech. So what does that mean? So let's take a look at Tosos. Tosos gives two possibilities. Bekever, Reish Lakish Amar Zeh Kever Shelifnei Hadibur. Shekodem Matan Torah. Now, V'tzarich iyun l'Rabbanan Reb Shimon Amri Av Kivei Ovdei Kochavim Mitamim Ba'ohel D'lo Dashina Natamatem Atem Kriyim Adam. Okay, which is a very difficult drasha. Let's bracket that for now. Amai Yitztarich Ba'o Bakever. Why do you mean Bakever if your position is that non-Jews cause Tumas Ohel? So what is he getting at? Whoever discussed non-Jews. So it seems that the way Tosos is understanding it is before Matan Torah. Basically, this is we all had a status of non-Jews. Well, I mean, that would be a little anachronistic. We didn't have a status yet of Yisrael. This is an interesting question, right? When halachically do we shift to this is Parshas Noach? When do we shift from Bnei Noach to a status of Yisrael, right? Is it from the moment Abraham is given Brit Milah? Is it from Maimed Har Sinai? There's a whole book written by, I think, the Mishnah called Parshat Drachim, that he works through all of these midrashim through this lens of seeing that like it was a machlokes, like reading this anachronistically, this machlokes of when did Bnei Yisrael have that status. So the whole debate of Yosef and the Achim says they told on him they ate Aver min Achai was really because Yosef thought he had a status of Bnei Yisrael and they thought he had a status of of Bnei Noah. Anyway, so this is an interesting question of when do we halachically get that status. Tosfos seems to be understanding that the point of Lifnei Hadibur is, if you assume that Tumas Ohel is only for Yisrael and not for Bnei Noach, so what would be the status of Tumas Ohel before Matan Torah? Okay, and let's say somebody, I don't know, who walked over, was in the same tent as somebody, as a dead body before Matan Torah. When it came to Matan Torah, are they Torah or are they Tameh? Okay, what's their status? What was the status of that 1 minute before Matan Torah? So Tosfos says, but you wouldn't need a pasuk to say that you're Tameh if you already say that non-Jews are Mitameh ba'ohel. So I don't understand why you need the pasuk to say you're Tameh if you were if you were in the same room, if you were in the same ohel as a dead body before Matan Torah, if it's true even about non-Jews, so why should it be any different? So he doesn't understand why. Okay, so presumably though he understood the drasha that if non-Jews are not mitamei ba'ohel, what this obekavet kever lifnei hadibur is saying is, but a Jew before Matan Torah would be mitamei ba'ohel. Non-Jews no, but Jews before Matan Torah yes. But if you say non-Jews are also mitamei ba'ohel, why do you need the drasha?
But you say we became Jews Matan Torah, there were no Jews for Matan Torah.
Okay, well whatever. Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Yes.
The Gemara in Sanhedrin actually uses the.
Well, maybe that's what it's telling you. Yes.
The actions of the Avot to derive Noachide laws.
Yes, right. So it's a whole fascinating Torah around all of that. But that seems to be implicit in what Tosfos is saying. But if non-Jews already are Matami Bo, what is Kever Lifnei Hadibur telling you? So Yesh Lomar, Reb Shimoni, okay, so fine, it is Reb Shimon who says non-Jews no, but Lifnei Hadibur yes. We know that, and I've mentioned this before, that through touch they are mitame. This is why the whole thing about Kohanim becoming doctors, it's not enough to say maybe they're not Jews, the corpses are from non-Jews, because the difference is only a difference really of Ohel, it's not a difference of touch. Okay. So he says, but nevertheless, it's still through Negia. So I'm not exactly sure. Wait, what's his question? What's his question? Because this is still a pasuk about Ohel. The Hachagabi Negia Ksiv. Oh, because I'm sorry, right? Because we're not this kever. This kever is kever satum, right? This kever by Ohel we learned that kever satum. We're talking about this kever. That's the one thing we didn't darshan. This kever we say, what happened? This died already in one day. We say that this is kever lifnei hadibur, and that's about touch. Right? This is the pasuk about touch. We're learning kever lifnei hadibur. So he says by touch. Presumably, everybody agrees non-Jews are matami through touch. So why do you need a chiddush of kever lifnei hadibur? That's his question. So let's see what.
Even though it's before dibur, you're still to make. Because why would you? So
what you're saying is maybe it doesn't have to do with the status of the person, Jew, non-Jew. It has to do with the fact before the law is legislated. Yeah. Excellent. So that's the next thing Tosfos says, which is probably what would be the more natural. It's not about the person. It's about does the law, are you grandfathered in as a, what's the status if you encounter that before the legislation? Could also be an interesting question, right? To what degree do you think all these things of Tumatara are metaphysical realities, or are they just halacha? If they're just halacha, before it's been legislated, it doesn't exist. Okay? So let's take a look. In the Hariva Piresh, Kevin Shalifnei Adibur, Gam Osam Shemesu, Kodem Matan Torah, Kodem Shenemra Parshas, or it should be probably La'achar Matan Torah, I think he switches it to. Kodem Achar Matan Torah. It doesn't matter, it's after Matan Torah. We're all Jews. But you know what Dibur hasn't occurred yet? The Parsha of Tumas Meis, right? That Dibur, the very specific one. So everybody has the status of Jews. We just haven't yet been mitzuvah on Tumas Meis. It hasn't yet come to the story with Midian and with Adam Ki Amut Ba'oel. That Parsha, it's way in Chukas. That Parsha hasn't occurred yet. Okay? The Salga Daitich Amina, I would have thought Adam Ki Amut Ba'oel, Mi Parsha Zuleilech. From this point on. So what happens if you came in encounter with it? Now, of course, the funny thing is that the whole problem with the Pesach Sheni was that Anachnu Tmeim Lenefesh Adam and so on. So, but that wasn't a kever. Maybe there were some laws of Tumat Meit that applied before, but some that were Nit Chadesh now, maybe they should only be applying from now on. Maybe kever is only from this point on. Certainly kever Satum, which is a new Allah or something, I don't know.
So a matter of several months.
Right. Where is, no, wait. And where Parshas Chukas? Where is that? Isn't that towards the end of the Arba'im Shana? Isn't that right before Midian? No? Am I misremembering?
Chukat has a 40-year gap in it.
Yeah.
And the thing with Midian was towards the end of that.
The beginning of Chukat says, well, we have a Bible scholar here. Dr. Fishbane, you want to resolve that for us? should we look it up?
I thought that was part of the whole debate.
Where exactly does the 40-year gap occur?
Exactly. It's not so clear, right?
Maybe until towards the end.
Yeah, this is before me.
Yeah, I mean the next parsha, Miriam dies, but right after Chukas, so she dies. So that's the end of 40 years. So exact right after the whole parsha Tumas Meit. Parsha says this was given towards the end of the 40 years. Yeah. All right. Anyway, all right. So what happens?
Or maybe it was given at Har Sinai and then it was.
All right, but that's not what Tos is assuming. Okay. So therefore, so this is a really good question. What is the status of people that had this state before it was legislated, right? So, and here what we're learning out, Kever Lifnei Hadibur, is, yeah, these halachas actually do apply. If you got into that condition before it was legislated, you still are tamei and you have to deal with your state, okay? Now this actually is very interesting because Tos is about to quote, we're learning this in the morning, the whole issue about Nida, and there's a similar drasha by Nida Nezava. It says, and Tos is about to quote it, it says, Chiyotzi b'zeh b'perek basur dehorios, d'matzich pasuk l'zav shalifnei hadibur. Ish ki yazov mibsaro mikan ve'elach. What if a man had a flow before Parshat Zavim was said? What if a woman had her period before the Parshat of Nida was said? Is she a Nida once it's been legislated, or it's only from that moment on? Okay, so this actually is saying, though, actually, if you have this state, even if it occurred beforehand, these halachot still apply. Which is, again, partly might do the question of how much is this just law, and how much is it assuming that there's a metaphysical reality here, so you have that state, and now you're being informed what are the relevant halachot about that state.
For what it's worth, it also seems to say the whole thing of was 38 years later.
38 years later. Okay, so there you go. When was Parshas Tumas Meit said?
It means that now
I understand that the beginning of it was said in the beginning. Yeah. Yes.
So Tosfos followed Rabbi's course because they say that part of the Torah was after Har Sinai.
Well, there's a whole debate in the Gemara about whether Megillah Nitna or Chasuma Nitna. So I understand you were being facetious. Okay, so now let's continue. Back to the Gemara.
For whatever reason, we're saying that people are sort of penalized before.
Not penalized. That's the state that they're in. You know, if you consider it to be a metaphysical reality and not just a legislation, right? So that's different. Meaning, if you entered into a contract that before Matan Torah we decided that Mashiach was Kohen, after Matan Torah Kesef is Kohen, or something like that, you wouldn't say, oh, it's too, somehow that contract wasn't binding because new law, whatever. But that's clear only about law. I think it's assuming that Tumah, the interesting thing, and I haven't done this, is, you could do it in 2 seconds on Bar Ilan, is look for Lifnei Hadibur, look through the Midrash Halacha, does it apply this idea of L'Rabos Lifnei Hadibur in areas not related to Tumah Tara? That's, I think, the interesting question, because by Tumah Tara you particularly understand that could be something that assumes that there's a real metaphysical reality here, right? So, yes.
If you're assuming a metaphysical reality, then the question is were people violent before, way before, not these people who are in the in-between state where before they didn't know what tumah was and then now suddenly they're tumah, but people who lived and died, and do we consider them having been tumah?
Yeah, but
and that's the metaphysical. The other one, law, even.
Yeah, but what would be the relevance of that? Meaning maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but there were no laws that attached to that reality. Right. Now we're saying this is a real state that you have, right? And now here are the laws that attach to it, right?
So I think that happens in law also. I like what you're doing with saying the metaphysical reality versus law, but I think it also happens in law that people can be their status can change.
Right.
Or that they
so the law can change their status, but what this is telling you is that the law can also address it. It's not like the status doesn't exist. The law, it could have, let me say it this way. It could have just as easily have said, we're not going to apply the laws to people that had the status from beforehand. But it's possible to apply it, but it is possible to make the choice to apply it for those that have the status, because it's not like the status is only created through the law.
Right.
The status does exist, so the law can choose to,
Yeah. It's like welfare reform, right?
Right.
Just because you increase or I don't know, whatever. You increase the minimum wage. It doesn't mean that the people before, like before that, they were making enough money and now they're not.
But again, that's because that's all a matter of law. And that's why I'm saying here it's possible to talk about it because we could say that even before there were any halachas of tumas meis, we believe that there was a metaphysical reality that you had this tumah that attached to you. That seems to be so. Therefore, we can go back and address that. All right, let's move on.
Somebody was tamei, and so then this parsha was revealed. 34 years later.
Right.
So then you go back and you apply those halachas to that person who's been living.
No, they're not held liable for having entered the mikdash or doing it. They didn't violate. But what you can say is, from this point on, because you have that status right now, because you touch this dead body, these are the laws you have to abide to. But from this point on,
so they'd have to bring a korban. Let's say, or they'd have to wait 7 days.
They'd have to wait 7 days. They'd have to do the sprinkling of paraduma.
In that reality,
with no relevant laws. Right, and now they're right.
You've been sick all along. We know what.
Okay.
Like even Aaron, it wasn't part of his whole ritual to do the.
Yeah, so obviously there was tumas meis before him because he had the whole discussion about Pesach Sheni. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this is finally the end of the Mishnah. That all these things is a Nazir Megaleach, and the relevance of a Nazir Megaleach is also that you sprinkle on day 3 and 7. If he had these tumot, it destroys the earlier days. And now the question here is, our girsa of that Mishnah is, I'll just go back and read the Mishnah. Our girsa of that Mishnah is, Umazia b'shlishi u'b'revi, you sprinkle the ice of the paraduma on day 3 and 7. The soter takodmin, it destroys any earlier count. The eno matili note el atli yitar, you only begin counting after your tahor. Umeviat korbanosav, and you bring your korbanot. So with that girsa, it's clear that you only begin counting on day 8. Your tahor on day 7, you bring the korbanot on day 8. What becomes clear from the Gemara we're about to read, and Tosfos says this explicitly, is that our Gemara did not have the girsa meviat korbanotav. It just says eno matili note el atli yitar, until you become tahor. So our Gemara wants to know, what does that mean? Does it mean you start on day 7, or does it mean you start on day 8 after the korbanot? So let's go back. Let's now look at the Gemara. Okay, Ibailu, we asked, Hadiktani ad sheyitar, until you become tahor. The Shvi'ikai, Ad Avid Herav Shemesh. Are we saying until day 7? Okay. Umani Rebbe Eliezer he. And what we mean is all you have to wait is until nightfall, because then you're totally tahor. And that's Rebbe Eliezer, you might remember earlier, that says that you can start counting even before you bring your korban. Once you're tahor, you begin your Nazirus of Tahara starting on day 8. Okay, because you're fully tahor at the end of day 7. So day 8 is the first of your new Nazirus of Tahara. Odilma B'Shminikai. Or maybe we mean on day 8 that Atli Yitar includes the bringing of the korbanot. Umay Atli Yitar, actually every korbanot until you bring the korbanot. Okay, meaning and you don't start counting until the following day. Umani Rabbanani, and it's the rabbis. Okay, so which one is it? So Tarishma, now it's funny because Atli Yitar, you didn't have the phrase maybe korbanot by Nazir Tameh. We know that the Tahara process really is done at the end of day 7, right? The bringing of the korbanot, you might say you need to bring the korbanot to initiate the new Nazirus of Tahara, but it would be funny to refer to that as not yet being tahor. Okay, but anyway, that's the question the Gemara raises. So let's see what the answer is. Tashma midiktani seifa, the end, which means the Mishnah we're about to read, that speaks about the things that a Nazir is not megaleach for. So the Mishnah we're about to read in 1 second, that a Nazir is not megaleach. What does it say? Matril umona miyad. That it says that these things are. It says we might as well look at it. Look at the very last line of this daf. Okay, we'll read the first part of the Mishnah, but these are a list of things that Nazir is not megaleach. It says umaze b'shlishi u'b'shvi. You sprinkle on day 3 and 7 because you still have to become tahor. Even if you're not megaleach, you're still tamei. So you do the sprinkling of the ashes. You still have to become tahor. The eino soter takodmin. It doesn't destroy earlier days. Umatchel umona miyad, and you begin immediately. Now, what is the immediately there? The assumption is immediately after day 3 and day 7. If you're a Nazir and you became Tamei Lemit, but you're not Megaleach, because it was, it was a Rova Kavat Samos, not a Chasi Kavat Samos. Fine, but you're real Tumas Mace. It might be you don't have to be Megaleach, it's not destroying the earlier days, but there's a taken for granted assumption you can't count Nazirus while you're Tamei Mace. Right? While you have Tumas Mace, you can't count it towards your Nazirus of Tahara. So when you are able to start continuing to count after your Tahor. So Mazib b'shlishi b'shvi umona miyad. Okay, umatchil umona miyad. So what does the miyad there mean? The miyad there means immediately after you become tahor. All right, is that clear?
It's clear, but it's not what you think the word miyad.
Well, after it says, wait. But not after I say. If I say, look, here's what you got to do. You got to sprinkle on day 3 and 7, and then you can begin immediately. So then immediately means immediately after 3 and 7. Okay, that's the way. I mean, I think that.
That way.
Okay, fine. That's the way it's reading it. Okay, and combined with the assumption that if you're tamei meis, you can't count it towards your Nazir Safara. Right.
In other words, if you don't have to be megaleach because the nature of the tumah, maybe there's a way where the gears did not connect.
I understand. I got it. But since the Mishnah is saying it's telling you sprinkle 3 and 7 and start counting immediately. Gemara is reasonably reading this as immediately after 3 and 7. So if that's what it's telling you by the cases that a Nazir is not megaleach, miyad means right after 3 and 7. So when it says by a Nazir that is megaleach, he doesn't begin ad sheyitar until he becomes tahor. It can't mean right after 3 and 7. It seems to be saying until a slightly later point. Is that clear? Yeah. By the Nazir, right? Okay. So therefore, it says. So the Gemara says, "D'miyiktani seva matchul monim yad hayrei shemai ad sheyitar ad sheyavi korbanosov." So when it says if beginning after day 7 is called miyad, so when it says ad sheyitar can't be day 7, it must be after day 8. So it must be until after you bring the korbanot. Umani rabbanon hi za'amri nazir shetara ad shmini lo chayla, that it does not begin right until day 8. Okay, one minute. I just want to see one thing before we continue. Hold on. Yeah, I think I might have misstated it earlier. For the question is, I got a little bit confused because the Gemara used the phrase earlier, Ad Shitar B'Shvi Kai Ad Avid Herav Shemesh, which sounds like Ad Shitar means after Herav Shemesh until day 8. But really, Rabbi Eliezer's position, and I was just double checking, Tosfos says this, Rabbi Eliezer's position is day 7. The real question is, so it's not Ad Avid. I don't understand the phrase. It doesn't seem like Tosfos doesn't quote it. You don't need Herav Shemesh on day 7. Basically, the position is either you do the sprinkling on day 7 and you begin on day 7, really before you do Herav Shemesh. That's Rabbi Eliezer's position. And the Rabbanon's position is, no, you have to wait till you bring the korbanot on day 8 and you begin on day 8. So the question is, do you begin on day 7 or do you begin on day 8? The phrase of Ad Avid Herav Shemesh, I'm not sure what it's doing, but it Tosfos explicitly says for Rabbi Eliezer, and that's like the Gemara earlier, for Rabbi Eliezer it's day 7, for the Chachamim it's day 8, and that's clear from the last line of the Gemara. It says, Rabbanon hi da'amri nazir tetara ashmini lo chayla, which means, but on day 8, it begins, okay? So if you say miyad, by the next Mishnah, it means you start when you're not megaleach, you start recounting on day 7. When you are megaleach and you have to bring the korbanot, ad sheyitar means you wait until day 8. Okay, let's now look at the next Mishnah, which we've been referring to a number of times, and see the list of things that a Nazir is not megaleach for. Okay? Aval haschachot v'hapraot. The schachot and the praot, which we're going to see basically means the overhanging trees and the outjutting, and the outjutting walls. So things which rabbinically we say you cannot walk under because we're afraid there'll be an ohel, but midoraita it's not really a concern. Why it's not a doraita concern we'll get to in the Gemara, but that's that scenario. So that's a type of a pseudo ohel. So we're not talking about the actual corpse itself or parts of the corpse. We're talking about the ways it's being transmitted. Ubeit pras.
I'm sorry, what was a praot?
Praot is an outcropping wall, like a wall that has jutting rocks jutting out of it.
Pharaohs in wild though.
Yeah, so it's like outcropping. It's not going straight. It's like, has juttings. Okay. Beta pras is a large field that a grave had been plowed over. And the rabbis say that for a very wide area around that field, in that field, you have to be concerned that there might be little bits of bones. So, midoraita, that would be, you would not have to be concerned, because it's, corpusing such a large area and so on. And again, because it's tiny little bits, it would only be if you were to touch them. But, midorabanan, we say that if you go through Beit HaPras, you are Tamei. The Eretz Amin, that's outside of Eretz Yisrael. We say the land outside of Eretz Yisrael is Tamei, and that could be for one of two reasons. Either because of a concern that, bodies are buried all over, which is funny because if non-Jews are not Matami Ba'ohel, right, who cares if they're buried all over if you're not touching them? So maybe it's because we're okay, the Jewish bodies, but where? Like all over? I mean, there's been a lot of Jewish tragedy, but still, it's an interesting question. Or what seems to be something that really factored into this Eretz Amim, and Tosfos says this explicitly, and we'll get to this today, is a type of a social national legislation to try to keep people in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so therefore, Eretz Amim is Tameh. Okay, it also could be a theological point, right? That Eretz Yisrael is only I'm serious. It's like is the land where God is present, and outside of it is an Eretz HaTzmeah. Okay, but that's all rabbinic. The Hagol of the Hadofak. Now, Gol and Dofak is an interesting question. What that means? Rashi says that means basically the top and the sides of the coffin. Okay, which are interesting because we already learned that a kever satum everything is mitamei. But here's an interesting question. As we know, there are some things that are tuma deoraita, like a half of a revius kavat samot, and we're about to get to other things that even if they're deoraita, technically a nazir is not megaleach. So we never have discussed the previous Mishnah. This whole Mishnah of a nazir megaleach didn't tell you what happens if he touches a kever not opposite the mate itself, right? We just discussed the kever satum, right? So what if you have, I don't know.
The kever, you mean like the coffin?
The coffin. Here you've got a coffin, right? And you've got this mate, right? And a nazir just touches this part of it, okay? So what's the story? He's not mahil on the mate. He's only tamei because obikaver kever satum. Is that included in the list of nazir megaleach? All right, we don't. Right, it was not in the previous Mishnah. So, and there are things that are tuma deoraita that the nazir is not megaleach. So Rashi reads Golo and Dofak as basically the sideboards and the top of the coffin. Tosfos disagrees.
So certainly the bottom.
Yeah, Tosfos disagrees, and Tosfos says that from other Gemaras it sounds clear that these are things that are above ground. So Tosfos says the goal and the dofak is the tombstone, and if they had like supporting stones that were to help keep it up, like so it wouldn't fall. That's the goal in the dofak, and that also we learn from. And one of the places we learn from is al pnei hasadeh. Before we learned that it's too much. But there's another drasha that says basically, and that's why Tosfos says it looks like it's above ground. Something of the mate that remains above ground, something that represents the mate. So it's the tombstone and the supporting stones, and that is a tuma deoraita, but nevertheless, and tumas mate deoraita, but nevertheless not nazir megaleach. Somehow we learned that that's not on the list of nazir megaleach. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good point.
Buried then, right?
But they're making a claim about the midrash halach. Well, the point is they did when they reinterred. No, they did a burial in ground and then a reinterment in the catacombs.
Right.
So, but that's a good question. Would they do? You mean like the stone that would seal the catacomb? Right. Maybe. That's interesting. I don't know what Tosfos would say to that.
Census has a photograph of such a stone.
A stone that seals the catacomb. Yeah. Oh, I see. Oh, that's nice, right over there. Yeah. Oh, there you go. So maybe that's a good. That's a third interpretation. We'll have to add that into. No, I'm saying that makes a lot of sense. Maybe Tosfos would have said that it's for the burial prior to the reinterment, but would they bother to put up a tombstone? I guess they needed a tombstone so they would know where to go back to. Okay, if you want to take a look, let's look at the short Tosfos. Hagolov Adofak. Tosfos Pirish Rash Perikam Diksuvos. Golov the Kisui Haron. The Dofak who Adofan Shalat Stadim. Okay, the Kashal of the times. I'm repaired Bema Maksha. Alpnei Asadel. Labas Golov Adofak. Mat Medahi Golin the Gluyenhain Golov Adofak. So Elu Mechuzanin. Sounds like they're exposed. Pirish Rabbi the Golov who Amatseva. The Dofak Avanim Shamatseva Nishenet Behen. Okay, so now maybe I don't know. Maybe he means your interpretation, which is that the stone is. I don't think he's calling the sealing stone the Matseva. So maybe he's being anachronistic, or maybe it's where they were buried before they were reinterred. It's a very good point.
I think the Chazal call what we call a tombstone a tziyun.
Right. Ubana ala tziyun. It's a pasuk actually. Right.
In other words, the marks of not to walk.
Right. I mean, now the Rabbi that was reminding me, and there's explicit look. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Clearly, like the whole idea. Clearly, there were burials underground. I mean, the whole discussion here that we just did about a Beis HaPras, which is a concern about a grave that was plowed, or all the Gemaras we're going to talk about that when you dig and you find a grave and you have to be concerned that there's a graveyard. So clearly, and that's in the Mishnayot, right? So I don't know enough about that, right? But I was blanking on that for a moment. But clearly, both phenomena were present. There's a lot of examples about being mitzayin at hakvarot, boat and all that. So there definitely was burial, not
royalty really put in certain.
Right, it could be right. Yeah, it could be had to have a certain amount. Right, if you could afford it or something. All right, we have to look into that more. But it's a very good point. But clearly there were both phenomena. Okay.
All graves are above ground.
That's in the water.
Okay. All right. So that is, but important is now we're introducing something that is D'oraita, but that is not Nazir Megaleach. And now we do the other things that we have mentioned. Revius Dam, a Revius of Dam, which is D'oraita, and a Nazir is not Megaleach. Okay. And that would be whether touch or ohel. Anything dam is there's no difference between touching and ohel. It's a revius dam for tuma, but a chatzi log for megaleach. And the ohel rova atzamot. It shouldn't be there. The ohel rova atzamot, and an ohel for a rova atzamot. So a rova atzamot, this quarter of a kav of atzamot causes tumas ohel. So yes, you are tamei d'oraita tumas meis, but you're not megaleach unless you are an ohel with a chasi kav atzamot. So this is the implicit, other side of the coin of what we did yesterday, of what we've been doing the last few days. Okay, that these things are tuma d'oraita, dam by touch, and ohel this amount by bones by ohel. But even though it's tuma d'oraita, not nazir megaleach. So now we've got those things. The lesser amount of blood and of bones is d'oraita, not megaleach, and the gola and dofak. And now we get to a very interesting next category, which gets back to our earlier pasuk. Right, the kelim hanogim b'meit. Okay, vessels that touch the dead body. So, what are we talking about? We could be talking about that we don't know of any halacha of cheref tichalal, or we don't know, or this is not cheref tichalal, however we define it. It's just a normal vessel that touches a dead body. Okay, but then that's pretty boring, because then the vessel touches the dead body. The vessel is an av. The person who touches it is a rishon, and that's not tumas meis. Tumas meis that destroys Naziris is a 7-day tumah, right? Is when the Nazir becomes an av, not when the Nazir becomes a rishon. So it's much more interesting if we assume that these are the vessels that fall into the category of cheref kichalo, and the cheref is considered an aviavos, like the mace itself, and the Nazir touches it, and the Nazir is an av, and it's a 7-day tumah, and even though it's a 7-day tumah, because it is one of those things that is not in the primary list, then even though it's a tumah d'oraita, it is not standard enough or not classic enough for Nazir to be megaleach. Okay, this is very relevant. I'll just tell you now why. When we get to it, if not today, we'll get to tomorrow. So you should be happy. We're slowing down a little bit, so we're not going to be so far ahead. But we'll get to tomorrow to discuss what exactly is in the category of cheref kechalo. Okay, but assuming that we're saying that in cheref kechalo is that it could be a full tumah, avi avota tumah like the mate itself, and nevertheless it's excluded that a Nazir is not megaleach. So if a Nazir is not megaleach, that also would mean that a Kohen is not mutar alav, because there's a line in Masechet Smachot which we passing by, Kol meit ein a Nazir megaleach alav, ein Kohen mutar alav. Okay, now normally, who cares? Meaning, what are the things we've excluded here? To Rabbanans, which, clearly they're not the Doraita. Rovat Samot, Revius Odam, that's not going to help a Kohen too much. Okay? Interestingly, according to Rashi, though, I should say, what might help a Kohen is the Golo and Dofak. Yeah. Because if the coffin is not Musar alav, if a Nazir is not Megalech, and according to that Musar, on the coffin, only on the mate, raises very interesting questions we discussed, right? Would you therefore say that you could be mahil over the whole thing, that it's maf? Or is it only touching? He's not musar, but if he's mahil over it, I don't know. Okay, right. But so that's one thing. But in terms of the kelim hanogim b'meit, if that's talking about a cheref kechalal, okay, wonderful. So a kohen can touch something that was in the same oil as a mate or that touched a mate. Who cares? What does that do for him? Okay. So here I want to tell you about a brilliant solution, which Rav Moshe had a fit about. About that Rav Herzog had for dealing with this issue. No, it was Rav Goren, excuse me. Rav Goren had for dealing with the problem of can a Kohen study medicine to become a doctor and come Tamei L'meis. So you remember we learned a few weeks ago that that other than the position of the Ravid, that even though we assume Kohanim are Tmei Meit, that they can't become Ritamei because they're raising the level of Tumah. When they come in contact, right, they're now their level of tum is higher. First of all, if they became tamei l'meis a week ago, they're more in the process of becoming tahor now, just because they could be more ready for the ashes of paraduma. But even besides that, their level is lower, because when you're actively touching a mace, it raises the level of your tum'ah. So Rav Goren said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and take some metal pins, and you like little pin or whatever, or rings or whatever it's going to be, and you bring them into a room and where there's a dead body. Now, all these rings are cheref kichalal; they're just as tamei as the mace itself. But a kohen is not prohibited to touch them if a nazir is not megaleach. So then have kohanim wear these rings. Now they are actively touching. So if this was my ring that was in the oil of a dead body, okay, I am now actively touching something that is as tamei as the mace itself, right? Because this ring is like an avi avot hatumah. So now, if I'm handling a dead body, I'm not raising my level of tumah.
Oh wow!
So therefore, even though I'm not allowed to become to the dead body, it's not a problem if it's not raising the level of tumah. And I was allowed to put on the ring because I'm not musar on something that is a kohen. Rav Moshe finds it a total fit oversat. But anyway, so that's an interesting area in saying that if a nazir is not megaleach, it has some relevance to a kohen.
Is it like your nose going into the room first? You have to put your nose with the ring into the doorway first?
No, once you're no. Anyway, fine. Okay, so anyway, that is a list. So what's really interesting there is Gola and Dofak on the one hand, which could be a Doraita, and Nazir not Megalech, and Kalim Hanogim B'Meit, which presumably is Cheref Kichalal, that even though it causes Tumas Mace, it's not Megalech. We'll see more about that. And now we deal with things that are not even Tumas Mace. Will be Mace Faro, will be Meg Maro. If he is a mitzora, and he is the days of counting and the days of completing, what does that mean? So somebody has a spot, and they're not sure whether it's sarat, and the Kohen comes and shuts them up and says, we'll look at it again in 7 days. Okay? We're going to see in a minute, that is a period actually which is referred to later in the Mishnah as Yumei Hesgero. Okay? The days of being shut up in quarantine for a week. That period, okay, we'll get to that in a minute. After that period, the Kohen comes back and the spot has spread. So now I'm a mitzora. But then now actually he shuts me up another 7 days to see if what will continue. But at this stage that it's already gotten worse after the first week, that's called Yemei Gmaro, okay? That I am now like, that I'm sort of closed up, as it were, and becoming that. Now, after it has actually cleared, and I call back to Kohen, and he sees that it's cleared, and then we go through this process of Tara, that's like a 7-day process. On the 8th day I bring my Korban, that's called Yemei Sfaro. So Yemei Sfaro and Yemei Gmaro, it's interesting, it's like the reverse chronological order, are the days where the guy's already definitely a mitzora at the sort of full level, but he is, continuing to sort of observe the spread of the problem, or he's in the process of becoming tahor, but he's a full level mitzora. Okay, so in those days, even though he's a full level mitzora, he's not megaleach, because it's not tumas meis. Al elu eina nazir megaleach, he doesn't shave. Umazir b'shlishu b'shvi, he sprinkles 3 and 7 for the tumas meis, not for the mitzora case, obviously. The eina soter takodmim, it does not destroy any earlier days yet, even though it's tumas meis. It doesn't destroy earlier days because of these exceptions. And again, the way we just read it is, okay, it doesn't destroy the earlier days, but he has to wait until to continue counting until he becomes tahor. Okay, the korban ein lo, he doesn't make a korban. Now, the Emet Amru, in truth they said, Yemei Hazav Hazava, if the person isn't a mitzora, person's only a zav or a zava, or you may have skerosh amator, it's a mitzvah, but it's in the first week when we're first monitoring the spread. In those cases, hare elu olim lo, they even count towards the he can even count those days towards his Nazir stage. Now, the normal response would be, well, like obviously he's not coming mace, right? We never saw that any other tumah is a contradiction. So it should be obvious. The real chiddush here is what it implies about the first line when it says umatchu miyona miyad, right? Which means he begins to continue counting after he's tahor. It basically means that for the mitzora that is a more weighty mitzora that's not in the first week, he can only continue counting after he gets out of his tsarat state. right? You understand? Because it contrasted the weighty Mitzora, who it says that he begins counting after he becomes tahor. So it says, but if he's a zav or she's a zava, or it's a Mitzora in the first week, then they can even count those days. Okay? So there's a real. So again, that's not a big chiddush. It's not too much mace. The real chiddush is the first point, which is you don't count. If you're Tmei Mace, even if it's not Megaleach, you don't count those days. That's not a big chiddush. But if you're a Mitzora and you're in the second week or the third week or whatever, you're more than the first week of a Mitzora, even those days you can't count towards your Nazirus. Not clear why. We'll have to see about that in the Gemara. Okay? So let's take a look. What time is it? We still no. Okay. All right. Let's just read one or two lines of the Gemara. Here's a schachot. A tree that's overshadowing on the land. Praot are hayotzes mina geder. Avanim hayotzes mina geder. Stones that come out from a geder. We think it's a fence, but it really means like a wall. Okay. Now, and you walked under those. Now, why are those only rabbinic problems? So let's take a look at Tosfos, and we'll end with this. Ilan ha-mesach al aretz, the perek damanida amina, the midoraisa lav ohel ma'alya. It's not a real ohel biblically. Shanafim rechokim zemizeh, the ein ben poteach tefach. That the trees, or the branches are spread out, so you don't really have a tefach by a tefach of solid matter in any one place. Okay? So that's why it's not really a biblical problem. Like if you look at a normal tree, right? A sort of spread out foliage, you don't really have do you have a tefach, a solid tefach? I mean, with the leaves, it depends how thick the branches are, how big the leaves are. So it's a case where it's not a real doraisa problem. Okay? There is a mace buried under one of them. Biblically, you're tahor if you walked under, because you really weren't under a real doraisa oel. Even if you went under all of them, you'd be tahor, because you were never under anything that was a real oel, or maybe it was a suffix and it was just a rabbin, but it's not clearly an oel here. And it's all rabbinic. So that's the case of the tree. What's the case about the wall? It's a wall near a cemetery. There's a fetus buried under one of the stones. I assume the reason you have to say fetus is because if you think about it, if there's a wall, right? I mean, what's the case? If there's a tree, right, and here's your cemetery, and here's your kever, and you're walking under here, you could sort of imagine, right, that the tumah goes, that if the canopy, if the roof, the tuna can transfer, right, from one side of the tree's neck. Certainly it will transfer on this side of the tree. But if it's a wall, right, if there's a wall, and the basic verse is here, even if the stones are outcropping, how does the tumah get over the wall? Right? I mean, what would be, you understand? So you have to be on the side where the mace is buried. But what are you doing on the side of the cemetery? Right? So that's...
both parts are overcropping from the wall.
Yeah, but even if it's overcropping, the wall is what's keeping it up. Right?
Why are you showing the cemetery?
A random place.
Well, I'm just saying Tosfos describes it. You don't have to say, but if you are saying it, right? Even if you have the wall sort of sticking out, right? I'll try my 3D drawing here, right? Like that. How's the tumah? Right, because it's not like a tree is a thin thing that's supporting it, so the tumah can get around, right? I mean, if you had an overhang like this, it could get around, right? And maybe that is what we're talking about. That's why I don't think that Tosfos says that there's an infant. Like maybe they bury, the normal mating in the cemetery, and they bury the fetuses right in the wall outside. That's why I'm imagining he's talking about it being a fetus, to explain how are you on the same side of the mate. Now, you didn't have to say it was a cemetery, but that's what he's saying. Okay, v'yesham nefel, the gazu chamim tuma lemahalik tachas achas min avanim, afki safik tum b'shasam seiko tahor. Now here he says a stone is a real ohel, but the question is, you don't know if there's a fetus buried there. I mean, maybe that would be a practice. Sometimes they would, but you don't know for exactly that they did. So technically, safik tum and b'shasam is tahor, but there are banan we consider you tamei. Okay, it's a suffix. You don't know whether you walked under the same place.
Not that the bulita would not be
exactly, but by the tree, it is that the OL is not an OL, and here it's that you don't know if there's a mace. So whether you don't know about the mace or whether it's not a clear OL, it's only rabbinic.
That's why he said it's a base kavarot, because as you suggest, in other words, it might very well be outside inside the wall of
right. Exactly.
where they were no eggs.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and that's why it's a safek. So either way, it's rabbinic, and that's why Nazir is not megaleach. And tomorrow we'll turn to the more interesting cases. They're all interesting. Excuse me. We'll turn to the other interesting cases of Eretz Ha'amim, Beit HaPras, Kerev Kechalo. Be a lot of fun. See you tomorrow.